Hi, everyone. You are very welcome back to the World Health Innovation Summit, a series of webinars around the 16 days of activism. My name is Deirdre Carberry, and I'm delighted to be joined this evening by Tyson Nicholas. Hi, Tyson.
Hi, Deirdre. How are you going?
I'm good. And I guess just by way of introduction, I'm just keen to provide a bit of context to where we're coming from in relation to the topic we're here this evening to discuss. And the reason why we're keen to talk about gender-based violence in conflict, crisis, and humanitarian actions. And really, it's drawing on our experience. So I served for 15 years as an infantry officer in the Irish Defence Forces. In that time, I served as an instructor in the United Nations Training School for about nearly 3 years, instructing on gender-based violence, protection of civilians, and civil-military relations. I also, in that time, was an international instructor assigned to the Peace Support Training Centre in Kingston in Canada, also instructing international audiences on peace operations. And starting last year, and up to present day, I'm also an attached international instructor and facilitator to the UK Defence Academy in Shrivenham, again, instructing on human security. In addition to that instructor training side, I also have a lot of operational experience from my time serving in the infantry, and I served also in 2 UN peacekeeping missions, one in Lebanon, as part of UNIFIL, where I was a platoon commander. And the last actually was just last year in the Democratic Republic of Congo, serving in the force headquarters. So that's a little bit about where I'm coming from in terms of my background, just to introduce the topic and to introduce kind of where I'll be coming from as well in relation to this discussion. So Tyson, I'd love to hear from you as well, and for you to share your vast experience in this space.
Yeah, certainly, Dee. So thanks very much again for introducing me. My name is Tyson Nicholas. I also sit on the panel of experts here at WIS to deal with gender equality, so Sustainable Development Goal number 5, gender equality, and I work obviously alongside Dee. In my career at the moment, I'm currently seconded by the Australian government to the United Nations, to the Department of Peace Operations, and I work there as the military expert on investigations into sexual exploitation and sexual abuse in UN peacekeeping missions. Prior to that, I've also had a military background and a background in international law. I served for about 18 years as a full-time officer in the Royal Australian Navy, and my operational service saw me serve a number of deployments to Afghanistan with the NATO International Security Assistance Force, to also serve with the United Nations mission in South Sudan, to serve on a number of border protection operations and counter-human trafficking operations in Southeast Asia, and also to serve in the South Pacific, delivering humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, in particular in Fiji. In terms of my background in sort of human security, I obviously, during my time in South Sudan, what I noticed was the prevalent use of gender-based violence, and indeed, in particular, sexual violence throughout the conflict, perpetrated by both sides or all sides to that conflict. That didn't sit well with me, and I guess I reached a culminating point or a tipping point in my career where I made a decision after my service in South Sudan that I would transition my career out of a full-time military career and into a career within the law, in particular international human rights law. And so I left my career in the military in Australia. I moved to Sweden and I undertook a Master's in Laws in International Human Rights Law at Lund University in the south of Sweden. I've graduated from that program now and I'm clearly working in the United Nations, but I've also had the pleasure and privilege to be able to also work as a lecturer at Lund University, and in particular to talk to students and to teach students now about issues to do with human rights in the context of peace and security, and with a focus there upon issues of human security. So we're talking here about thematic areas of peacekeeping, women, peace and security, children and armed conflict and child protection, protection of civilians, and sexual and gender-based violence. Like Dee as well, I also work or have done some instructing for the UK Defence Academy on their Defence Human Security Advisors course, and have been involved with the Nordic Centre for Gender and Military Operations as well. So that's kind of my background and where I've come from a military perspective, but also an international legal perspective, and where I currently work in the United Nations, dealing with issues to do with sexual exploitation and sexual abuse in peace operations.
Amazing. Thank you, Tyson. And I think, I mean, what you've highlighted there by touching on all the issues is really the complexity and the range of issues when we do talk about human security. And I think through our series of webinars, it's been one of the things we want to highlight in relation to gender-based violence. It's not one thing. There's not one root cause. It really is a myriad of different causes, issues, complexities as well. And in terms, I guess, of where we are with the World Health Innovation Summit and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and linking it to the discussions we're having throughout the 16 days of activism, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development emphasizes, as we all know, a world free from fear and free from want. And really, what does that look like, and why is it so important? Well, to achieve this transformative process, Agenda 2030 does call for a new approach to address the interconnectivity of today's challenges. And that's been one of the themes that we've tried to maintain and highlight throughout the discussions that we've been having, and throughout the speakers that have surfaced so many important issues and topics, but ultimately also outlined the important actions and tangible actions we can take to actually address and prevent gender-based violence. When we talk about human security, really to this end, human security provides an effective analytical lens and programming framework, and one where, for our panel, Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment, one where a gender perspective must be mainstreamed throughout. And that's, when we talk about mainstreaming, it means that it permeates every aspect of what we do, from how we look at our budgets to how we analyze the situation, the social dynamics, the distribution of power, the risks and opportunities that individuals have, because gender equality is one of the major human developmental challenges around the world. And we see that equality is not merely a political or an ethical issue, but it also serves to guarantee the effectiveness of development policies and programs. And when we look at conflict specifically, and what we're here to talk about this evening, we know that there's a direct correlation between inequality and insecurity. And one of the best indicators of conflict is actually gender equality. And that's what we're really here to talk about today. The larger the gender gap is, our research says that the more likely a country is to be involved in an intra or interstate conflict, to be the first to resort to force, and to also resort to higher levels of violence. So we do see that human security is an approach to national and international security that gives primacy to human beings and their complex social and economic interactions. I think it's interesting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. For us in the military, I think human security does take a little bit of a departure from traditional security studies, which maybe focuses on the security of the state. Or I know from my time in the military, certainly in the early days, there's a big focus on say, the enemy, in terms of, doing our analysis of the operational environment. In terms now, I mean, we're now in 2020, and we now understand human security. How is it that we're able to take this more holistic approach? And what's been your experience of how militaries have pivoted and are now taking a more holistic approach to security in the operational environment?
Yeah, Dee, look, I think that's a great question, and I think it requires a bit of a nuanced answer. I think that in respect to how militaries deal with issues of human security and an assessment of the factors of human security and the idea of that freedom from fear, from want and indignity, there's still a way to go. And I put that to you just in respect to the point you made about us often being asked to consider what the most likely and most dangerous course of action is for an enemy when we do our assessments based upon our operational environment. We often consider as well the most likely and most dangerous course of action for other partners. So what we call our green force partners, those who are working along alongside it and also through. And we often do the same when we think about as well our allies or the coalition part that we would work with as well, which we would call our blue force. So enemy is a red force, green force is who we're going to work through. So, for example, in Afghanistan, working through the Afghan National Security and Defence Forces. And indeed, then when we talk about our other blue force partners, we're talking really about our close allies there. So in the context of a NATO mission, it's other NATO partners. In the context of an EU mission, it's EU partners. And in the context of the United Nations, it's other member states who have contributed troops to a mission. But I think what often gets left behind is a real honest assessment of what we would call the white space or that humanitarian space. We often think about it in terms of civil military engagement, but we often don't think about it in terms of how it really affects the overall security situation and our ability to achieve our objectives against an enemy, which is really, when we think about modern conflict, we're often not seeing a great deal of international armed conflict where it's two states fighting each other across the plains of Europe or indeed in other locations. What we often see when it comes to conflict these days is conflict of a non-international character. So that what I mean by that is internal civil wars, internal civil unrest. So what is classified by lawyers as non-international armed conflict. And that's an important classification from a legal perspective when it comes to the application of various laws and international humanitarian law. But I think it's also important in the context of how military operations are also executed on the ground. And the reason for that, I would put to you, is that when we're looking at involving ourselves in non-international armed conflict, we're probably looking at either reinforcing a member state or a nation state that's asked for our assistance, or indeed operating alongside perhaps a non-state actor against another member state. But that's less likely because of the classification of the conflict. But in any case, what it really means then is that we're talking about population-centric type operations. Population-centric type operations is really a fancy way to say we're looking to win the hearts and minds of a local population as a means to secure stability and long-term peace in a country. And that will never be fully achieved. And I guess we've seen that in many examples of more modern conflicts. Afghanistan is an example, Congo is an example, Mali is an example, South Sudan is an example, Iraq is an example, and Syria.
Can I ask, based on those examples that you've given, which I think are quite interesting, I'd maybe put out a statement that militaries are more capable than ever at war fighting, but possibly less capable of solving conflicts. The examples you've given are very much underpin like protracted wars, conflicts, a cyclical nature as well of conflict. We're seeing it, reemerge time and time again. In terms, though, of those countries that you've mentioned, all have either one or two significant peace operations in place, either through the United Nations or through NATO, or maybe individual state actors who are conducting a particular national operation there. Mali being a good example, say with the French, there's an EU mission there, and there's also a UN mission in place. Based on that, how effective do you think these international organizations are at actually addressing the root causes of the conflict and bringing it to an end? Are we seeing that as a possibility, or are we just seeing that the cycle is continuing? And what can we do to actually to prevent that, to prevent the cycle from continuing, and to making sure there's more effective, I guess, responses in terms of those countries?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is one hell of a question, and I think if I could honestly solve that in a great deal of detail, I'd probably be up for the Nobel Peace Prize in being awarded to me in Oslo. But in the absence of not being able to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, I guess I'd offer a couple of key points. The first key point is there needs to be, at a political level, a commitment towards achieving a peace. There also needs to be, at a political level and a strategic level, an understanding of what winning looks like. What does success actually mean? And without being able to define what success means, we will never be able to utilize at an operational level and a tactical level, for example, a military organization to be able to achieve an unknown outcome. If I put it in those terms there, and I think in some of the examples I gave you, perhaps if we look back in hindsight, we would realise that the political objectives and the overall end state for a campaign was not as clear as perhaps it should have been. But I guess I'd also offer the point that in some ways militaries are being asked in many of these complex conflicts, these complex crises, and these complex emergencies, being asked to not only just be a blunt instrument of national and indeed international organisations, but also to, in some ways, be able to utilise an aspect of military diplomacy and be able to deliver beyond just a warfighting capability.
Yes.
And I think you're 100% accurate in saying that some militaries have never been more lethal and more capable of waging warfare. But that's when you can easily define an enemy, when you can seek and close with that enemy, kill or capture that enemy, seize and hold ground and repel attack. And that is just not what occurs in, say, population-centric or asymmetric warfare, where there are many, many aspects to the conflict. And indeed, many of those have much more of a humanitarian approach. I'd also offer as well that some militaries would rightly say, and perhaps not unjustly say, that their role is warfighting, and that the humanitarian aspects of a conflict, a crisis, or indeed a stability situation is the responsibility of other actors. But I would also then throw back to militaries and say that sometimes when you're the only person on the ground and you're the person that people are looking to, you've got to be able and willing to be able to provide some level of assistance to civil societies in order not only to actually satisfy basic human rights and be able to satisfy those needs for human security, be able to provide physical security, shelter, reliable food sources, potable water, sanitation, education, economic opportunity, those things that if you're working alongside another nation, a nation state who's asked you to be involved in the conflict to support them, that's important. But it's also important because you will never achieve a lasting peace without being able to satisfy those needs for a civilian population. And I guess that also points to other aspects when we talk about gender-based violence. Yes. And we talk about gender equality without being able to address those particular issues and indeed be able to provide not only the physical protection and security to prevent gender-based violence, but also the ways and means in which you can actually respond when it occurs as well. So, missions at various international levels, whether they be EU, NATO, UN, or indeed unilateral missions, all struggle with these concepts. I guess what I'm saying is it's such a highly complex operating environment that it really takes a significant amount of coordination amongst a whole bunch of actors to all work towards an end state to be able to achieve a semblance of peace. And so that's I guess that for want of being able to not being able to solve those protracted conflicts, what I would say is that the majority of these organisations have absolutely best intentions and absolutely are committed to the ultimate goals of peace and security and human rights. But having those best intentions and those goals at a strategic level needs to translate down to operational and tactical actions on the ground. And that's where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, and that's something I'd love to touch on as well, particularly as so many people tuning in are involved in developmental programs. And I'd love to share kind of one of the most recent examples I have of my time in quite a complex environment in terms of development, but also in terms of a country that has undergone a protracted conflict. There's a humanitarian crisis and just I guess a myriad really of human security factors is hampering peace and stability efforts in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So when I was there in 2018 and 2019, we had Ebola, measles, so really serious health crisis ongoing in the country. Human rights abuses, ethnic violence, children recruited into armed groups, limited employment opportunities, limited access to education, significant sexual violence against women, men, and children, and economic and food insecurity. So a lot of those human security factors that we're talking about, and a lot of the points that we've touched on during our discussions during our 16 days of activism. And if we take sexual violence in the DRC, it was very clear that the effects of sexual violence echo across generations through trauma, which we've touched on in a previous discussion, stigma, poverty, poor health, and unwanted pregnancy. And what was clear to me is that it tears away at the very social fabric of these communities, and ensures that communities are destabilized for generations to come. And this is very much clearly where, you know, while I had been involved in the education side, the policy side, with both the UN and NATO, it's actually being there on the ground and seeing the effects of sexual violence in terms of the effects it has on communities, on children, on the cohesion of communities. Many children that I met who were now in orphanages or in some kind of care as a result of being born of rape, their existence emanates from that violence. And what I found heartbreaking was that they were labeled bad blood or children of the enemy. And, you know, I guess meeting them and meeting the women and men who were survivors, it was really putting a human face behind the suffering. And with sexual violence against men and boys, it was certainly widespread. It was used as an instrument of torture, humiliation, terror, and, you know, very clearly, again, reinforced in me that the bodies of women, men, and children are now part of the training conflict. It was actively used as a tactic of war. And, you know, when you are aware of, you know, the statistics, read all the reports, you know, have a look at the case studies and go through training exercises, I don't think anything prepared me for that human face of fear, of suffering, of anger and betrayal. And as well, when I looked at, I guess, the mission mandate from the UN, it was a really strong, robust mandate in terms of a protection of civilians mandate. It was a very strong mandate in terms of preventing sexual and gender-based violence. But there were cases where maybe the mission wasn't as effective or didn't have the resources or capabilities that it possibly should have had. And this was evidenced in a report called the Santa Cruz report. It specifically looks at the DRC. And again, with the DRC, it plays host to the largest UN peacekeeping mission in the world. And it's still one of the most expensive peacekeeping operations in history, costing about, I think it's about $1.1 billion annually. And as I said, with that protection of civilians mandate. So I guess, I mean, if you had advice, particularly from your human rights background, from your operational background, we see that the DRC isn't unique in the challenges it faces, and you've listed some of those countries. And we look to the Sahel, where violence rates in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger doubled in the last year compared to previous. And I'd just love your advice, and to those of us, that are listening as well, that are involved in maybe the defense and security sector, or that are partnering with militaries in terms of these multidimensional peace operations. What actions can we take, or how can we do better as peacekeepers, as military planners, to address some of the issues that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, look, those the issues that you raised in particular about the DRC, as you mentioned, do exist across a number of conflicts, but are in and of themselves pretty confronting in terms of the topic and the nature of, in particular, sexual violence there, sexual violence against both women and girls and men and boys. And I think, look, I just offer the observation that you're not alone in terms of your preparation when operating in the field to actually come across this level of violence. That's certainly something that I also experienced in my time in United Nations mission in South Sudan. I didn't feel as though I was adequately prepared for the level of sexual and gender-based violence, and in particular conflict-related sexual violence that I saw. That's the reason why I reached the tipping point that I did in terms of making a decision to transition my career, because I really wanted to work at the intersection of human rights and peace and security, and really work on issues of gender-based violence, and in particular sexual violence. And so, with that in mind, noting that we both, with a combined level of experience of around almost 40 years between us in two militaries, if we're both saying that we felt unprepared and perhaps had a lack of training related to what it was going to be like to be able to go into complex environments like that, and see such violence and such deplorable use of violence to really target the heart and soul of communities, and to also to terrorise and to displace and to torture people. Then I suppose my first bit of advice would be that as militaries or the security sector needs to be better about how it prepares personnel that are going to go into those environments to be able to not only deal with actions to do with targeting an enemy, not only training troops to be able to seek and close, kill or capture, repel attack, seize and hold ground, all those sorts of things, and conduct actual war fighting, but also prepare troops for some of those other nasty aspects that they will invariably see in modern conflict, and certainly across all the conflicts that we've mentioned thus far. The use of sexual violence is prevalent. The use of sexual violence as that strategy to really target the will of an enemy to fight by attacking those that the enemy cares most about, being their families or those tribal groups, or indeed other aligned populations, is something that I think all militaries could do better at preparing personnel for. And that's just not the theoretical preparation. It's all well and good to give a brief, to actually sit down and have a discussion and explain to personnel what they may come and be faced with. But it's also another thing as well to integrate that into complex training scenarios that are of a practical nature out in field exercises. And I think that's something that, if we're going to take human security seriously, and we're going to look at being able to operate population-centric counterinsurgency operations, asymmetric warfare in a land domain, but also as well how we can train those people who are operating in a maritime domain when they come across, for example, human trafficking at sea connected to a conflict, whether they be maritime personnel operating in the Mediterranean, maritime personnel operating around the Horn of Africa, and so on and so forth, how they will also respond to that in those maritime boarding environments, how people operating in the air domain who are perhaps conducting intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, what they should do and how they should be prepared to be able to deal with these types of things as well, because they will invariably also see that when, for example, they're using intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets like unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, to be able to observe people as they're on the move, as they're being displaced, probably because they're being targeted both with killing, but also being targeted by sexual violence. How do we train those personnel to best cope with that and to be able to best respond to it in a way that where they can recognise perhaps not only just when it occurs, but perhaps those warning signs. And I think that comes back to the integration of a gender perspective and the purpose and intent of the Women, Peace and Security agenda to be able to conduct gender mainstreaming, so that when we do not only our analysis of the operating environment and our analysis of the human terrain, but also when we look at then what are our threat actors, what are the enemy's most likely and most dangerous courses of action, we consider that from a gendered perspective. And we consider actions not only enemy against enemy, where they be non-state or state actors, but also enemy against populations. And I think that would be a practical way in which security organisations can implement effective change in the immediate. I think that would be my first observation. I think the other thing as well is to simply to call it out and to not accept it. And so certainly that is a big thing as well. And whether that means through discussions like this, you and I are calling it out and saying it's unacceptable, but also as well, militaries making it very clear where they stand on these issues. That's important. That's important because it signals to the personnel in their own military what the standards are, but it also then signals to those that they work with, alongside and through what the standards are as well. And I guess that takes me to the idea of what is sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. I don't know if we want to touch on that now, but it might be worthwhile to sort of mention that as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think so. I think it's a really important topic. I mean, one of the central tenets or principles for peacekeepers and security forces, obviously, that are deployed is, first and foremost, do no harm. Certainly when it comes to the civilian population and those that they are mandated to protect. But we do see failings, and we have seen significant failings over the years. If we just take the UN, for example, and it's something that can very much undermine the effectivity of peace operations, but also, I mean, the reality is, very much impact on the lives of men and women and girls and boys, those that are looking to the UN as their, as people that are either going to liberate or save them or protect them. And I'd be really interested, to hear from your perspective about sexual exploitation and abuse and how it does impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll just define what sexual exploitation and sexual abuse is. It's a form of sexual and gender-based violence, but it's unlike conflict-related sexual violence, where it has a nexus to the conflict aiming to achieve a political or military objective. Sexual exploitation and abuse is a little different in that when we talk about sexual exploitation and abuse in a UN setting, we define it as where UN peacekeepers, whether they be military personnel, whether they be police personnel, or whether they be civilians operating under a UN flag, wearing a blue helmet or a blue body armour, where they would actually participate in either the exploitation or the abuse of a local population. A local population that, in the vast majority of cases, they are mandated to provide protection to. And that's why it's so egregious from a UN perspective, and why there's zero tolerance for impunity and zero tolerance for not taking action when it's reported. The UN realises that there's never going to be a case of zero cases, and the zero tolerance policy doesn't necessarily align to zero cases, but zero tolerance and zero tolerance for impunity, zero tolerance for not taking action. So that's what sexual exploitation and sexual abuse is. The abuse aspect of it is what we would consider to be criminal actions, so rape, sexual assault, and other forms of sexual violence as a crime, whereas sexual exploitation in a UN context is essentially whether there's any sexual activity between a UN peacekeeper, again, whether they're military, civilian, or a police personnel, with a local population. And the reason for that is due to the power imbalance. So when we talk about human security, and we understand that human security requires at least a basic access to resources, in an environment where there's conflict and crisis, or indeed humanitarian action is required, often there's obviously a lack of those of access to those resources. So survival sex, where people engage in sexual activity with a person, for example, a UN peacekeeper, in exchange for access to some resources, so exchange for food or potable water, or consideration for those goods, or indeed, as in the most recent allegations for the UN's response to the Ebola crisis in the Congo, whether they engage in sexual activity in exchange for employment within an organisation as a locally employed civilian. So in that respect, that's what it is. And clearly, I would just point out as well that sexual abuse is whether it's a consensual relationship or not with a UN peacekeeper or with a person who's under the age of 18, it's considered to be a sexual abuse. it's not an act of exploitation, it's abuse, because a child cannot give informed consent to be able to engage in sexual activities with an adult. So in that respect, there it is fundamentally egregious. It is something that is an issue. It's an issue within, I would put to you, all international organisations, not just UN missions or UN special missions or UN agencies. It exists across humanitarian agencies and humanitarian actors as well, and indeed other international organisations, whether they be NATO, EU, or the like. And you are 100% correct. It directly impacts the ability to achieve long-term operational goals when those long-term operational goals require the earning of the trust of a local population. The quickest way to undermine your own credibility is indeed to be engaged in sexual exploitation or sexual abuse of a local population, because just like with conflict-related sexual violence, the use of either sexual exploitation or sexual abuse will indeed have effects that not only affect that one generation but are multi-generational. We see that with children born to relationships between peacekeepers and local population women, and so when it comes to paternity cases, but when it also comes to how those children grow up and how they're perceived in their own communities, or indeed how they're ostracised from their own communities. So it creates further instability, and that is why the Secretary General has been so clear on what sexual exploitation constitutes, which is indeed a code of conduct violation, and indeed may actually be a criminal act, depending upon the nature of the act itself. In my role, that's where I'm engaged with the UN, and obviously what I'm working towards. And one of the reasons why I've been engaged in working towards that is clearly because I have a passion to deal with the issues of sexual and gender-based violence based upon my own experiences and my own career profile. And so, I would put to you that, that sexual exploitation and sexual abuse is also, like with many other things in the human security space, and like we've talked about several times, interconnected with those other thematic areas of peace and security and human rights. So the idea of do no harm, as you mentioned, that fundamental aspect of human rights. Beyond that as well, then the women, peace and security agenda, child protection and children armed conflict issues, and protection of civilians in particular. But it also as well, in acts of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse may indeed result in perpetrating the conflict even further, and particularly if it contributes towards the development of extremism in a conflict setting or a crisis setting. So I guess in that respect, there it is pretty fundamental to peacekeeping operations. It is an absolute fundamental no-no. But that said, we don't live in a perfect world, and in a perfect world, we would be able to say it's never going to happen. The reality is that we need to be able to take action when it does happen. We need to take action to do as best we can to prevent it. And prevention measures there include education programs, include training for troops, include making sure that we do background checks into personnel who are going to serve in missions to ensure they haven't already been accused of any sort of impropriety like that. And then when it comes to sort of the response to how we're going to actually take action for it, then we're looking at there addressing reporting mechanisms so that local populations can report instances of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse, investigatory mechanisms, accountability mechanisms, whether they be through conduct and discipline, or whether they be through administrative consequences, or indeed criminal consequences for that. And then, of course, the ultimate or the final pillar there is about how we support those who are indeed survivors or victims of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. And we do that through a Victims' Rights Fund that supports that. There's a special representative of the Secretary General for Victims' Rights, Jane Connors, who looks at those particular issues as well. And indeed, we also run a victim-centered approach throughout all of the approaches to sexual exploitation and sexual abuse in a UN setting. So that's sort of, I guess how it's dealt with. It can be hit and miss. And I would also caveat by saying as well that that at the end of the day, when it comes to holding personnel accountable, in the vast majority of cases there, it does rely upon the criminal, the conduct and discipline, administrative or criminal law systems within member states who are indeed contributing personnel to UN missions. That is, they maintain sovereignty over their personnel, and they also maintain the responsibility to investigate and to indeed hold accountable those individuals.
And Tyson, if people wanted additional resources in terms of, say, the United Nations zero tolerance policy on sexual exploitation and abuse, or if they themselves have found themselves in a situation that constitutes a violation, where would you point them in the direction to? Where can they go and seek help? Where can they go and tell their story and try and put an end to the impunity that sometimes exists around, these crimes?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways in which you can do it. So if you're in an area where there is indeed a peacekeeping mission, the first thing you are highly encouraged to do would be to actually raise a complaint through the mission, and so that is one way in which you can do that. But that is often difficult, in particular for some people to be able to access that. But look, there is other information, other websites out there. So the one that I often point people towards is the United Nations does have a significant amount of information available on its website under the banner of preventing sexual exploitation and abuse, and so it's for example www.un.org/preventing #sexual #exploitation #and abuse. And on there, you can find information about the Victims' Rights Trust Fund, victim assistance, the UN approach to it. You also on there find all the resources, all of the Secretary General's bulletin from 2003 that created the zero tolerance policy, as well as all the Secretary General's reporting to the General Assembly that occurs every year. You'll also find all the data there about data on allegations, allegations substantiated, and what types of allegations they are. And in the vast majority of cases, what we're really talking about here is acts of sexual exploitation. In the vast majority of cases where, it's absolutely forbidden for UN personnel, as I mentioned, to have any form of sexual relationship with anyone who is a local national in an area where UN is undertaking a peace operation. But that obviously does occur, and when it occurs, the great thing is that it's being reported, it's being captured, it's being investigated, and being followed through. Sexual abuse is less prevalent insofar as acts of rape and so on and so forth is not the primary MO of people that do get involved in sexual exploitation and sexual abuse, but we do consider both on that spectrum. So we do talk about it in terms of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse.
Amazing. Well, Tyson, there's so much information there, and I guess it just does highlight the complexities when we are dealing with this issue. But ultimately, again, I think, as you highlighted, a huge amount of progress has been made in a lot of ways. There's still probably more progress to be made. And if I could take maybe just kind of a key takeaway for me in terms of kind of what you've mentioned, and I guess, what we could take away, say, from a World Health Innovation Summit, UN Sustainable Development Goals perspective. When we look at, I guess, conflict, crisis, emergencies, sexual and gender-based violence does occur within the greater context of the political economy of gender-based violence, or, violence against women. And we do see, I think, as you've kind of illustrated, the underlying purpose is frequently the expression of power and dominance over the person assaulted. And we do see that conflict as well can exacerbate existing inequalities within a community power structure and lead to an increase in sexual and gender-based violence. And I think what's interesting is, you've highlighted the role of international organizations, peacekeepers, both civilian, military, and police, that they are really looked to as protectors, and it's a position of privilege, that people are given within these incredibly vulnerable communities, and it's one that, as peacekeepers, that has to be taken incredibly seriously, and certainly to be held to higher standards. And when we're looking at it in the context of sustainable development, we see that unless this is addressed, unless a gender perspective is mainstreamed, you know, we're not going to get that progress in terms of sustainable development that we all want, and that we're all looking to achieve. And I think you said it very well, that for population-centric operations to respond to the security needs of the whole community, all those affected by the conflict, crisis, or emergency, our understanding, and that is our understanding, and the biggest hour in relation to society, developmental programs, military security forces, host governments, our understanding must be gendered. We must understand the roles that males and females play in a society, their access to power and resources, because this will help us in understanding the specific threats affecting women, men, and girls and boys. And how, I guess, understanding these threats and how they are interdependent and interrelated allows us to put in place a more appropriate or specific protection, a prevention, and a response strategy as well. In terms of kind of a key takeaway for you, and something that you'd like to put out as a key learning to our audience before we finish up, I want you to take the last line.
Oh, thank you. And look, I think the first thing is you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse, and that is that protectors should never be predators. I guess to look at that as well. With great power comes great responsibility, to quote Spider-Man. In that respect, there, I say that not to make light of the situation at all, but just simply to point out there that it absolutely is the case that when people are charged with protecting and providing a protection mandate, they should never become predators. And it really is as simple as that. You draw a line under that, and that's the first key takeaway when it comes to sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. When it comes to other issues of sexual violence in a conflict, I think the other key takeaway here is that it's never acceptable. It's not acceptable in a conflict environment, but it's also not acceptable in a crisis, in a humanitarian action situation, or indeed sexual violence is not acceptable in times of peace either. And so we carry this through along the entire way. Sexual and gender-based violence, and in particular sexual violence, is never an appropriate response to any type of situation. And you're 100% correct when you say that when it comes to sustainable development, it's a catch-22. You will never achieve sustainable development without being able to eradicate sexual violence, but at the same time, sexual violence will hold you back from achieving sustainable development. And so, in that respect, there it has to be a nuanced approach, an approach with a gendered perspective. I'd even put you an intersectional gendered perspective in terms of how we understand an operating environment for places with conflict, crisis, and or requiring humanitarian action, complex emergencies, and so on and so forth, so that we can understand those impacts on men, boys, women, and girls, and how that affects them intersectionality across the communities. And without doing that, we can't honestly tell ourselves that we're doing an accurate or a useful human terrain assessment to be able to allocate resources against the various threats that are out there.
Okay, amazing. Well, on that, a huge amount of learnings. I look forward as well to on Thursday's session, providing a synopsis and kind of an overview of the 16 days. Tomorrow, for anyone tuning in, we have a fantastic session on women in healthcare and looking at gender-based discrimination and workplace harassment, looking at some advice and actions that we can take, what issues are being encountered, and having an in-depth discussion around that, again at 7 p.m. Tomorrow evening. So I just want to thank Tyson. Thank you so much for being so candid and for your expertise and knowledge in this space. I think there's so many incredible learnings to be taken from that and from what you've shared with us. So thank you for your time, and I can't wait to see the incredible work that you'll do in relation to progressing the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse as well within the UN. And certainly I know as a society, just in wider society, external to international organizations, it's an issue and something that has to be tackled as well. So not to other the issue, this is very much a whole of society and community approach to combating sexual and gender-based violence. So thank you very much.
Thanks again, Dee.